Eve Turner was sitting in her bedsit and mindlessly looking through the latest issue of a well-known modelling magazine. Ever since she was a child, she'd always dreamt of being featured in a magazine like this. Her mother had always encouraged her, but she could never quite find the big one that would give her the chance that she needed. Up until now, she had to be content with local photo shoots for obscure advertisements and publications. It wasn't much, but it helped to pay the bills. As Eve was lost in thought, the sound of her phone buzzing on her coffee table broke through the haze. She threw the magazine onto the table and quickly grabbed the phone in her hand. It was an email. She rolled her eyes slightly. She was getting a lot of spam emails lately. No doubt this would be another. Pressing the mail icon with her index finger, she couldn't believe her eyes. Ever since imitating one of his pieces for a high school art project, she'd always admired the work of Victor Pascali. His stunning marble piece on the beauty of the female form was breathtaking. She often found herself poring over pictures of his latest pieces online. The email was from his personal email address. She initially thought it must be a scam, but she wondered how someone would have known what he meant to her. Looking at the email further, she read on. "My dear, I was very fortunate to discover some of your work in a local magazine. I must say I was instantly captivated by your natural beauty and form. As you may be aware, I'm very secretive about my muses and inspirations. I'm looking for a subject for an upcoming personal project of mine, and I'm inquiring as to whether you would be interested in being that subject. I can't emphasize enough that this is highly confidential until the work is released to the public, so your discretion is much appreciated. I'm willing to pay a handsome sum for your services. I'd like you to model exclusively for me over several days, after which point I will compensate you for the fee of £100,000. I trust that my completed piece will sell for far in excess of this, so this will benefit both of us greatly. If you're interested in becoming my muse, please contact me at your earliest opportunity. Kindest regards, VP." This had come completely out of the blue, but it was just the chance she'd been waiting for. To actually have the chance to work with such a famous artist as Mr. Pascali was unbelievable. The incredible payment was just the cherry on top. Without a second thought, Eve replied to the email in haste, asking for more information and expressing her gratitude for being considered. After letting out a deep breath soon after clicking send, Eve got up slowly and walked to the kitchen of her tiny studio flat. Just as she was pouring the milk into her steaming cup of tea, her phone buzzed yet again. It couldn't be him already, could it? Padding over to the table, she lifted the phone and checked the notification. It was true. Within just minutes of her responding, he'd come back to her. He must be eager, she thought. Victor had provided his personal contact number and asked if Eve was willing to meet with him at his studio the following day to discuss the project in detail. And with that, they both exchanged several more emails and texts throughout the day to arrange her visit. It came out in conversation that his studio was actually in his home, and she couldn't believe her luck that she was actually going to see inside the personal quarters of an artistic genius. Eve could hardly sleep that night. She tossed and turned, wondering about how this opportunity could change her life for the better. And so, with that, the next day, Eve arrived at Victor Pascali's studio, a sprawling mansion located on the outskirts of town on a remote road. She'd never even been in these parts before. The building exuded an old-world charm, complete with ivy crawling up its stone walls and large ornate windows in between. After taking a moment to take in her surroundings, she rang the doorbell. Just moments later, the door swung open to reveal Victor himself. Victor was a notorious recluse, and Eve felt honoured to be one of the few people to see him in the flesh. He was taller than her and was very thin. She was struck by his sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. His hair was pure silver, and he had an air of elegance about him. Despite his somewhat intimidating appearance, he greeted her warmly and invited her inside. "My dear girl, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you," he said, placing his hand between her shoulder blades. "I've been an advocate for your work for some time now, and I must say, I'm captivated by your simple, yet pure presence. I believe you are the perfect muse for my latest project." Eve hardly knew what to say. She was lost for words. After a brief pause that seemed like an eternity to her, she whispered out, "Thank you, Mr. Pascali. The pleasure is all mine. I'm honoured that you're a fan of my work." Eve was trying her utmost to keep her voice steady. "Please, call me Victor," he said, with a disarming smile. "Come, let me show you around and explain what I have in mind." With that, and with his hand still placed firmly between her shoulders, he led her through the impressive mansion. On the way, pointing out various pieces of artwork that adorned the walls. Each piece was more stunning than the last. However, she didn't have much time to admire each piece before Victor's hand pressed against her back, urging her onwards. Eventually, they reached a large, airy studio with a skylight. Rays of the afternoon sun beamed in, illuminating the room in a refreshing, natural light. Easels, canvases, and half-finished sculptures were scattered around the room. It was fascinating to see how such a genius worked. "This is where the magic happens," Victor said, openly gesturing around the room. "My current obsession is the notion of beauty and timelessness. I'm creating pieces that feel truly alive, as if the subject is frozen in a moment of pure perfection." Eve nodded, intrigued by his vision. Victor's eyes gleamed with excitement as they met hers. "I want to create an eternal image of you, my dear. You have such unique features, ones that rival the Mona Lisa herself. But don't fret, the process is very simple. I use a series of plaster moulds. It won't take much time at all, dear. But I assure you, the result will certainly be worth it." The prospect of being immortalised in one of Victor Pascali's masterpieces was far too good to pass up. Almost immediately, Eve agreed to the project, and they both spent the next few hours discussing the finer details and logistics. He was meticulous in his explanations. He'd clearly done this many times before. "May I see the pieces you've made before?" Eve asked. She was curious to know what the finished product would look like. "All in good time, my dear," Victor exclaimed, with an almost dismissive wave of his hand. As the sun began to set, Victor showed Eve to a guest room where she'd be staying for a few nights while the piece was being completed. The room was lavishly decorated, complete with a luxurious 4-poster bed and ensuite bathroom. This was a massive step up from her humble bedsit. "Make yourself at home," Victor said. "My staff will make you anything you wish for meals. Simply use the phone. We'll begin the first session tomorrow morning. Rest well, dear, You have a big day ahead of you." And with that, he gently closed the door behind him as he exited. Eve felt butterflies in her stomach. She wasn't sure if it was due to hunger or excitement, but she was eagerly awaiting the outcome of the piece. This was her chance at a better life. She ran herself a bath, and not long afterwards, fell into a relaxed and blissful sleep. The next morning, Eve woke up more refreshed than she had in a long time. Her bed back at home was not comfortable at all, and the bed she'd been provided with was as soft as sleeping on a cloud. Perhaps this is the lifestyle she could look forward to in the future now. After dressing, she made her way through several corridors back to the studio, where Victor was already setting up the materials for the plaster moulds. He greeted her with a silent smile and gestured for her to sit down in a chair in the centre of the room. "I've been awaiting this moment for weeks," Victor said. "Let's start with your head and shoulders," he continued, gently repositioning her in the wooden chair. "This will be the most challenging part, my dear. You need to try your best to remain perfectly still while the plaster sets. But don't fret. I'll be here to guide you." Victor carefully applied a layer of petroleum jelly to her skin to prevent the plaster from sticking. And then he began to slowly apply the wet plaster strips over her face, neck and shoulders. The sensation was strange and slightly uncomfortable. The strips were cold, and it almost felt claustrophobic. However, Eve remained still, trusting Victor's expertise. As the plaster began to harden, Victor continued to speak softly to her, calmly explaining the process and keeping her calm throughout. The cadence of his voice was almost hypnotic. She had to fight several times to not just fall asleep in the chair. Once the mould was set, he carefully removed it, revealing a perfect impression of her features. Eve was amazed at the level of detail captured in the mould. "Yes, excellent," Victor said, meticulously examining the mould with a satisfied smile. "You did marvellously, my dear. I'll need to take a few more sets, as unfortunately the process can damage them. But that shouldn't be an issue for someone like you." Eve sat there on the hard chair, with a smile plastered on her face. Her unconscious picked up on something, deep in the recesses of her mind. Since she'd met him, he hadn't used her name once. No doubt it was just a personal quirk of his. She dismissed the thought as soon as it surfaced. The process continued for the rest of the day, taking cast after cast of her face and shoulders. It might not sound too demanding to sit in a chair motionless for hours, but by the end of the day, her back was aching. Later that afternoon, Eve explored the rest of the mansion, marvelling at the decadent artwork and opulent decor. She noticed that Victor clearly had a penchant for collecting sculptures and statues. She was struck by how lifelike some of them were, almost as if she could feel a soul exuding from them. This must be why he was so infamous and respected as an artist. There was something different about his works. As she wandered from room to room, she stumbled upon a closed door at the end of a long and dark hallway. There was no natural light here. Instead, it was shadowy and dingy. She spun on her heels to turn back, but curiosity got the better of her. She approached the door and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Just as she was about to turn away, Victor appeared behind her. "Ah, my dear, I see you've found my private gallery," he said, his tone playful, yet with a serious undertone. "It's where I keep my most prized pieces. Perhaps one day I'll give you a tour. But for now, let's focus on the task at hand, Eve nodded, feeling a slight unease at his sudden change in demeanour. That unconscious thought that surfaced previously was louder now, but again she dismissed it. Any artist would feel stress from creating a new work. It's completely understandable. As time went on, Eve and Victor grew closer. She found herself opening up to him, sharing her dreams and aspirations, while he revealed more to her about his artistic philosophy and the inspiration behind his sculptures. On the third and final evening, after an especially grueling and tiring session in the studio, Victor invited Eve to join him for dinner in his grand dining room. The majestic table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, with the main meal being prepared by Victor's private chef. Before they started to eat, Victor raised a glass of the finest red wine and proposed a toast. "To the finest muse in the world, my dear. Thank you so much for allowing me to use you for my art. The end product will truly be the best I've ever created, I feel. One for the ages." They both talked and laughed, enjoying each other's company. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Eve felt completely at ease. That nagging voice at the back of her head was now no more than a whimper, and she was starting to see Victor as a friend. After dinner, Victor quickly excused himself to take a phone call, leaving Eve all by herself in the dining room. Without the warming sound of laughter, the dining room felt incredibly harsh and cold. It was as if any noise was being sucked out of the room, so much so that she could hear her heart beating and her shallow breathing. As she continued to sip her wine, which was the best wine she'd ever tasted, she couldn't shake the feeling of curiosity that overwhelmed her a day or two ago about the locked gallery. As much as she tried to focus on other things, her mind kept drifting back to it. She was helpless. Considering this was the last night she'd be spending with Victor, she reasoned to herself that she would never have this opportunity again. So with a sigh, she came to the decision that she needed to take another look. She wouldn't be able to forgive herself if she didn't. As the floor was marble, there were no creaking floorboards to worry about, much to Eve's relief. She lifted herself from her chair, careful not to make a sound, and crept out of the room. She quietly made her way down the maze of hallways, going by memory, until she found the locked door again. As she approached, there was a sliver of light erupting from it. To her surprise, the door was slightly ajar. Glancing behind her quickly to ensure that there was no one else around, she tentatively pushed the door open and stepped inside. The gallery was dimly lit, a far cry from the bright and extravagant lighting in the other rooms of the mansion. Numerous candles were lit on the tables spread around the room, casting eerie, dark shadows on the walls. Eve struggled to hold in her awe and amazement as she scanned around the room with her widening eyes. The gallery was filled with sculptures and busts, each one more lifelike than the last. The heads and shoulders of various women, some with their hands and arms too, were displayed on lavish pedestals, their expressions frozen in time. They were absolutely beautiful, and Eve knew that these must have all been similar models that had worked with Victor previously. If her work of art was to be anywhere near the quality of these, she'd be very pleased. Something caught Eve's eye, however. In the glow of candlelight, she saw a reflection come from one of the busts. It was a young woman, with a flowing blonde wig which looked like real hair. Her features were graceful and elegant, with defined cheekbones and a feminine chin. What caught her attention, though, was a glassy reflection from the bust's eyes. Victor had done such an amazing job. It honestly looked like the model was really standing there. Eve edged closer and closer to the bust. As she approached, she could see the azure blue eyes that were set into the eye sockets of the bust. The candlelight was dancing within them. It was beautiful. Victor truly was a one-of-a-kind artist to achieve something like this. She gingerly reached out to touch the cheek of the piece, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. Suddenly, a voice behind her made her jump. "What are you doing in here, my dear?" She turned to see Victor standing in the doorway, his face a mask of anger and disappointment. "Sorry, I was curious," she stammered. "I couldn't resist seeing your private collection. I'm sorry, I should have asked." Victor's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained hard and cold. "I told you this room was off limits. These pieces are very personal to me. I give a piece of myself to each and every one. They represent years of hard work and dedication." "I'm sorry, Victor," Eve said, feeling a knot of fear in her stomach. "I didn't mean to intrude." With that, Victor sighed and stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Ah, yes. I suppose it's only natural to be curious. These pieces are indeed special. I pour my heart and soul into each of them, making sure to capture every minute detail. These pieces have soul, my dear. They're more than just works of art. They're a testament to the miracle of creation, the fragile, simple beauty of the human form." "They're amazing, Victor, truly amazing," Eve said. "I hope my piece will be just as perfect." A wide smile formed across Victor's well-defined face. In that moment, he looked the happiest that he'd been since she met him. "Oh yes, I'm confident that yours will be the best yet." As before, he placed his hand upon her back and ushered her out of the room. Taking her back to the guest room, he stood in the doorway for a brief moment before shutting the door. "Tomorrow, my dear. Not long to go now." Eve lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind was filled with the images of the lifelike busts, and the previous thought from her unconscious was now screaming at her. Something wasn't right. She had to satisfy her curiosity and find out the truth. Looking at the clock, it was just after 2 a.m. The mansion was completely silent. Grabbing her phone for light, she slowly opened the door and made her way back to the mysterious gallery. Luckily, it seemed as though Victor was so concerned with showing her back to her room that he neglected to lock the door. She slipped inside and shut the door behind her softly. This time, the gallery was pitch black. Eve could feel her breathing start to quicken. She'd never liked the dark, ever since she was a young child. Unlocking her phone, she turned on the flashlight. It cast a precise bright white beam across the room, the light glinting off the eyes of the bust that caught her attention earlier in the day. She cautiously approached the artwork, with her phone beginning to shake in her hand. In this light, the realistic eyes on the bust seemed almost sad. As she examined the bust further, she noticed something that she hadn't seen before. The dim light in the gallery served to hide these details previously, but were now painfully obvious with the bright light from her phone. Tiny, almost imperceptible seams running along the edges of the piece. Her heart pounded in her chest as it dawned on her what they were. surgical incisions. The horrible truth began to dawn on her. These weren't just lifelike sculptures. They were real human body parts, preserved and displayed as art. She came to the sobering and terrifying realization that Victor had been using real women, models like her, to create his masterpieces, capturing their beauty in the most macabre way possible. Eve felt a surge of adrenaline. Her body was in panic mode. Every fibre of her being was screaming at her to get out of there, to escape before she became his next unfortunate victim. As she was about to turn to leave, she saw the familiar dull orange glow in the bust's eyes. The door had been opened. "My dear, I see you've discovered the secret to my art," he said, his voice now cold and devoid of all emotion. "I'd hoped you wouldn't find out until it was too late, but I suppose it was inevitable." "Victor, please," Eve begged, her voice trembling in fear. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." Victor calmly shook his head and grinned. "I'm afraid I can't do that, dear. You see, you are the final piece in my collection. My perfect muse. The one who will complete my vision of truly timeless beauty." Eve's mind raced as she desperately tried to think of a way out. She glanced around the room, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. Her eyes fell on a heavy sculpture on a nearby pedestal. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, she lunged for the sculpture and swung it at Victor with all of her strength. The heavy piece struck him cleanly on the side of the head, and he stumbled backwards, dazed. Eve didn't waste a second. She ran past him and down the hallway. She knew that she had to go through the dining room if she was to escape. She'd built a good understanding of the layout of the mansion in her short time here. Shoving the door open to the dining room with an almighty bang, she sprinted to the other side of the dining room to the opposite door. Turning the doorknob frantically, it wouldn't budge. She let out a scream of frustration. As Eve tried pointlessly to open the door, she felt a sharp pinprick in her neck. Turning around, she saw the chef that had cooked their meal earlier in the day. He was holding a syringe in his hand. With an ice-cold feeling enveloping her whole body, her vision began to fade before falling to the ground. Then, complete blackness. Muffled noises could be heard, as if submerged underwater. After a short while, the words began to take form and become clearer. "Are you awake, my dear?" Eve's vision was blurred, and she struggled to see the vague shape in front of her, but there was no mistaking that voice. Victor. Eve tried to speak, but all that came out of her mouth was a weak groan. She couldn't form any words. "I may be a supremely talented artist, dear, but I don't have the skill to use knives in the proper way. The kind of precision that a top chef would have. I couldn't do it without him. I create the vision, and he provides me with the materials." She could feel him brush her cheek. She tried to pull her head away, but to her terror, she couldn't move a muscle. Victor continued. "Many artists use marble and stone for their creations, all products of Mother Nature. Why am I so different? Why should I not use the epiphany of evolution to create a masterpiece? Are we not also products of Mother Nature? She's given me such wonderful materials. Surely it would be an affront to God if I were not to use them." A tear formed from the corner of her eye and began to roll down her cheek. She could now feel his hand cupped underneath her chin. "Please, my dear, don't fret. The vast majority of humankind are lost to time and space after our cruelly short time on this earth. They are not remembered. Your natural beauty will now be immortalized forever. You should be thanking me. The spectre of aging will not threaten you now. You shall be forever young. My greatest creation." Victor's voice continued to drone on, her consciousness fading. She struggled against the overwhelming weight of the paralyzing agent, but her body betrayed her, remaining motionless. "But I'm not so cruel as to have you suffer for my art. Thank you, Eve. Thank you." As she realized that he had finally used her name, she felt another sharp pinprick in her neck. The familiar coldness swept throughout her body as her vision began to dim once more, ultimately giving in to the encroaching darkness. Weeks later, visitors filed into the mansion. The exhibition sold out in minutes. It was the first time that Victor Pascali had been seen in public for decades. Only the richest luminaries could afford tickets. There were glasses and bottles of champagne as far as the eye could see. "Welcome, esteemed guests." Victor's voice resonated through the grand hall. The distinguished crowd fell into a hush, hanging on to his every word. "Tonight, you will witness the culmination of my life's work. An exhibition that transcends the boundaries of art, humanity, and nature." The attendees, dressed in extravagant gowns and tailored suits, moved in awe through the gallery. They marvelled in astonishment at the lifelike sculptures, whispering in hushed tones about the brilliance of Victor's genius. Victor guided them to the centerpiece of his collection, a statue draped in velvet. "Ladies and gentlemen, my entire life has led me to this moment. The moment when I lay bare the simple beauty of Mother Nature. The same Mother Nature that has given birth to all of us and allowed us to mould the world in her image." With a theatrical flourish, Victor pulled away the cloth, revealing a bust of Eve. Her face was serene, captured in an eternal moment of grace, yet with an imperceptible sorrow. The audience gasped in admiration. A nameplate of etched gold lay in front of the piece, simply titled Eve. "Behold," Victor announced, "the pièce de la résistance. Eve, my ultimate muse, my everlasting masterpiece." The room erupted in applause, the guests oblivious to the horror that lay beneath the surface. Victor's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, knowing his secret would remain concealed within the marble-like facade. Eve's eyes, now fixed and glassy, could only watch as she became immortalized as Victor Pascali's most famous art piece. Her sorrow forever visible on her perfect, unaging face.